My name is Wren Calloway Hargrove, and I am 43 years old, and I want to tell you about the Tuesday morning in March when I sat at the far end of a conference table in a law office in Dayton and counted the ceiling tiles. 22. I'd counted 22 by the time Robert Calendar opened the folder, because counting was the only thing I could do with my hands that didn't look like what it was, which was praying. There was a coffee ring on the edge of that legal folder, the kind that happens when you work with a mug always at your elbow, when you reach for a document without looking away from what you're reading. And I recognized that ring before I'd fully registered anything else in the room, and I did not let my face do a single thing about it. The woman at the other end of the table was wearing pearl drop earrings and a dusty rose blazer and a gold brooch at her lapel, and her white hair was cut in a perfect bob, and she had not looked at me once since I walked in. She had spent the better part of 2 years telling anyone who would listen that I was not family. I want to tell you what happened when the lawyer read the part of the trust that had my name in it. But before I get there, if you've ever sat in a room where someone else had the authority to decide whether you counted, whether the 14 years you'd shown up for were real, whether you existed in the official version of a story you'd been living every day, hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Kettering, Ohio, which is the kind of place that people from other places have never heard of, and people from Kettering understand exactly why. My father was a line supervisor at a manufacturing plant for 22 years, and my mother cleaned houses 3 days a week. There was enough food and enough heat, and not a great deal beyond that. I had 3 siblings and a father who was the most qualified person on his floor, and watched a promotion go to a man with 8 months of experience and a college degree. And I remember the night he came home from finding out. He sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. And I was 11 years old. And I understood something that has never entirely left me. Some people don't get credit for what they've done. They just have to keep doing it anyway. I certified as a vet tech through Sinclair Community College on money I earned at a diner working double shifts on weekends. I paid the last installment the same week I passed my boards. There was no one particular to call. I went back to the diner that night and worked a closing shift. I met Garrett Hargrove at a backyard cookout in July of 2009, and he was funny and a little lost and honest about what he didn't know, which was rare enough that I noticed it. We got married 2 years later. And that is how I entered the orbit of Roy and Bette Hargrove. Roy had built a construction company and sold it before his health got serious. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in Dayton with a garden Bette maintained like a second vocation, and they had a history I was now standing adjacent to, but never quite inside. The first Christmas I spent with them, Bette gave me a gift set of candles. Nice candles, wrapped perfectly. The bow exactly right. Roy gave me a book about Ohio wildflowers because I had mentioned offhand at a dinner in October that I'd always wanted to learn to identify them. He had remembered. He'd gone and found a book about it. He handed it to me on Christmas morning and said, "For Wren, so she can name what she finds." I still have it. I brought it to the reading in March. I'm still not entirely sure why, except that it was the first time anyone in that family gave me something that was specifically for me. Something that said, "I was listening when you spoke." If you've ever been in a family where you worked to belong and it never quite settled, where you showed up every holiday and remembered everyone's preferences and got the small gifts right and still ended up being Garrett's wife, and not a name, you know the particular weight of having someone really hear you. If that's sitting somewhere in your chest right now, tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Hit like if you're still with me, because I promise you, it goes somewhere. Now stay with me. I want to tell you about the Sunday dinner in February, 14 months before the reading. Roy had been gone for about 8 months. There were 7 of us at the table, the turkey still on the board. Garrett's cousins at the far end, my daughter Cora watching something in the other room, my son Miles asking someone about a video game. And Bette set down her glass. She had a particular way of setting things down, very deliberate, the kind of stillness that tells you something is about to be said. And she said, with a lightness that had been prepared, "I just want everyone to know that when I'm gone, this family stays in the family. Wren, I'm sure you understand." No one looked up. Garrett moved the breadbasket. I sat in the silence that fell after that, the particular silence of a room deciding collectively not to hear a thing. And I know that silence. I grew up in it. And I know what it means when everyone finds a reason to look at their plates. I said once, quietly, without heat, "Roy always said I was family." Nobody responded. But Donna, Roy's sister, 67 years old, in her navy cardigan at the far end of the table, raised her eyes from her plate and looked directly at me. She held the look for 3 full seconds. No smile, no nod, nothing demonstrative. She just looked. The way you look at someone when you want them to know they haven't disappeared. And then she looked back down. I drove home that night, and I didn't say anything in the car because Cora and Miles were in the back seat, and I would not let them feel the weather of what had happened at that table. When we got home and the kids were settled, I went back out to the car, sat in the driveway with the engine off and the porch light on, and I gave myself 4 minutes. Exactly 4. Then I dried my face and went inside. Here's what you need to understand about Donna Wachtel, because she matters to this story more than anyone realized, including me. I had known her for 14 years. She showed up at holidays. She sent the kids $20 on their birthdays with a handwritten note. She and I had exchanged Christmas cards every single year. Short ones, just enough to say, "I know you exist." I had never thought of her as an ally. I'd thought of her as someone who had learned to navigate Bette by staying slightly out of range, which was a skill I respected and did not yet have. But that look across the table told me something I couldn't name yet. And 3 weeks later, at Cora's school fundraiser in the church gymnasium, Bette introduced me to the pastor's wife as Garrett's first wife. Donna was standing 3 feet away. She said, without pausing, without raising her voice even slightly, "That means his only wife. They'll be married 15 years this summer." The pastor's wife smiled at me warmly and said that was wonderful. That changed the subject immediately and smoothly, the way someone changes a subject when they're not sure what just happened to them. And I thought about that for the rest of the night. Not in triumph, because it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like evidence. It felt like someone had marked something down. 3 weeks after that fundraiser, Garrett came home from work and asked me, carefully, as if he had rehearsed the careful part, whether I had spent any time alone with his father during Roy's last year. I knew the handwriting. I just never expected to see it come out of his mouth. I answered Garrett's question honestly, because I don't know how to be dishonest in a way that doesn't cost me something I can't afford to lose. I told him yes, I'd spent time alone with Roy during his last year. I'd driven him to a few appointments when Garrett couldn't get away from a job site and Bette had her garden club. I'd sat with him in the study sometimes on Sunday afternoons, while Roy looked through old photographs and told me things about his childhood that I don't think he'd told many people. I told Garrett I didn't know why he was asking. Garrett said he was just trying to understand. I said I understood. And that was where it ended for that night. Or at least where the spoken version of it ended. What didn't end was the question behind the question, which I could feel settling into the walls of our house the way cold settles in through the foundation in winter. Not as a draft you can close a window against, but as a temperature the building itself absorbs. After that conversation, I noticed that Garrett had started answering his phone in the other room. I noticed that his Tuesday and Thursday evenings got quieter when I came in. I don't say this to make him the villain of the story, because he isn't. I say it because you need to understand what the silence actually sounded like, how it had weight and texture, how it wasn't peaceful the way silence can sometimes be peaceful. It was the silence of a man trying to hold two truths at the same time in a container that wasn't built for both of them. Bette, meanwhile, was not silent. She told her church friends that I had been always too close to Roy during his illness, framed with the careful sadness of a woman who was only worried. She called Garrett's cousin Marcus and mentioned that Roy had been not quite himself toward the end, that people had taken advantage of his generosity in ways the family was still untangling. She did not say my name in most of these conversations. She didn't have to. The inference was directional, and everyone knew which way to point it. I found out about some of this through Donna, who heard things in the margins of family events, and occasionally, without fanfare, relayed them to me in the kind of flat tone that means, I'm telling you because you should know, not because I think you should do something with it yet. I found out about some of it through Garrett's cousin Lydia, who ran into me at the grocery store in September and asked how I was doing, with a specific inflection that told me she'd heard something and wasn't sure whether to believe it. I said I was doing fine. I said it in a tone that I hoped told her she could hold off on believing things until she knew more. She nodded. She bought her groceries. People in small orbits do a lot of that, nodding and buying groceries, and waiting to see how things resolve before committing to aversion. I worked extra shifts at the clinic. 8, sometimes 9 shifts in a 2-week period, which was more than the schedule required, and which my supervisor Janice noted once, gently, asking if everything was okay at home. I said everything was fine. I took the euthanasia appointments no one else wanted, held the animals through the needle, talked to them the whole time. There's a particular quality to that kind of care. The care you give something at the exact moment it needs care most. The care that doesn't get witnessed or remembered by the thing receiving it. That felt familiar to me in a way I didn't examine too closely. One afternoon in late October, I was driving home from a closing shift, and a song came on the radio that Roy used to hum in his study. Just a fragment of something old and formless that I wouldn't have been able to name. And I had to pull over. I sat on the side of Wilmington Pike for about 6 minutes. Not crying, just stopped. The way a machine stops when something inside it has reached a temperature it wasn't designed to sustain. Then I pulled back into traffic and went home and made dinner and helped Miles with a science project about the water cycle and went to bed. And this is the part where I have to ask you something, because I think you're watching this for a reason. What do you do when someone is telling a story about you? A wrong story. A story designed to make you smaller. And you don't have the evidence yet to counter it. And the people around you are too polite or too scared or too loyal to the wrong person to say anything. Leave me your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. I've thought about it a lot since. Stay with me. We're about to get to the part that changed everything. On a Wednesday morning in October, Donna called me. Not the kind of call you expect on a Wednesday morning. Not the brief check-in kind. She said she'd been helping Bette sort through Roy's study the previous weekend. The books, the files, the accumulated weight of a man's working life. And she'd found something in the back of the bottom desk drawer, behind a folder of old tax returns. A small, brown moleskin notebook, the kind Roy bought in bulk from the office supply store. Not the household one, which Betty kept on the kitchen counter for grocery lists and appointments. A private one. She said she'd opened it to see what it was, and she'd read enough to know she needed to call me. She read me one entry over the phone. It was dated 14 months before Roy died. Roy wrote, "Wren is the kind of person who stays. Not because she has to. Not because she doesn't notice how much she's giving. But because she decided once that Garrett was worth it, and she kept her word. Garrett got lucky, and he doesn't know it yet. I hope someday he does." Donna read it in a steady voice, and then stopped. I was sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot. I had pulled in 3 minutes early for my shift and hadn't gone inside yet. I sat there for 23 minutes after she finished reading. I didn't speak. She didn't speak either for most of it. At some point, she said, "He made a private appointment with Robert Callender, Wren. About 3 years ago. I drove him. He asked me not to say anything." I said, slowly, "To Callender?" She said, "Yes. He went alone. I waited in the car." She said the appointment was in the morning. Roy was in good health then. It was a year before any symptoms, and she had the date because she'd written it in her own calendar the way she wrote everything. Out of habit. She told me the date. My hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I thanked her. I said I'd be in touch. I went inside and worked a 9-hour shift and did not drop a single thing. The following week, I drove to Robert Callender's office on my lunch break to drop off a release form that Garrett had asked me to deliver. Routine paperwork, nothing to do with the trust, or so I believed at the time. The assistant let me leave it at the front desk. While I was waiting for a receipt, I could see into the open file room through the half-open door. There was a row of legal folders on the shelf, organized by surname. The Hargrove folder was rust-colored and thicker than the others, and on its edge, in faded ballpoint, in handwriting I knew from the inscription inside a book of Ohio wildflowers, someone had written the tab label. And on the edge of the folder's cover there was a coffee ring, old and dried, the exact diameter of the mug Roy kept in his study. I drove back to the clinic. I finished my shift. That night I called Callender's office from the driveway, Garrett already inside, the kids at the table, and left a message asking whether I was a named party in the Hargrove Estate Trust. The assistant called back the next morning and said she was not able to confirm specific provisions, but that all named parties would receive formal notification of the scheduled reading. I sat with the word named for the rest of the day. That evening, Garrett came home and told me, carefully, that Bette's attorney had filed to clarify certain provisions of the trust, and that as far as he understood it, I wasn't involved. I said I appreciated him telling me. He went to help Miles with his homework. I stood at the kitchen sink for a while, looking out at the yard in the dark, thinking about a coffee ring on a legal folder, and what it meant that I'd recognized it before anything else in that room. There is a skill you develop doing veterinary work that nobody talks about when they describe the job. It is not the medical part, though the medical part is real and matters. It is the part where you learn to manage your own nervous system in the presence of something that requires precision, where you hold a frightened animal still, not by overpowering it, but by becoming, for that specific moment, the calmest thing in the room. You go very quiet inside. Your hands don't shake because you don't let them. You do the thing that needs doing. I had been doing that for 8 years at the clinic. I had not, until now, understood that I had been doing a version of it for 14 years at the Hargrove family table. The week before the reading, I went through every document I had ever signed or received in connection with the Hargrove family estate. There were not many. I had not been involved in Roy's finances. That was Garrett's domain, and before that, Roy's alone. But I had 3 things that I put in a folder of my own. The receipt from a flower delivery I had organized for Roy's hospital room, signed for in my name, dated 18 months ago. A birthday card Roy had sent me 2 years before his death, which he had signed, "Love, Dad," the only time he ever used that word, and which I had kept in the wildflower book, and the copy of Donna's calendar entry that she had photographed and texted me, showing the date of Roy's private appointment with Calendar. I did not know if any of these things were relevant. I brought them anyway. I also drove to the school fundraiser the Friday before the reading, where Bette was manning the baked goods table in her pale wool coat, and where I had to sign in as a volunteer for the literacy drive. I signed my name in full. Wren Marie Calloway Hargrove. The woman at the registration table read it back to confirm the spelling and said, "Beautiful name." I thanked her. Bette was 4 feet away and had heard every word. She did not look up from the baked goods, but Donna, who was pouring coffee at the next table, looked up and met my eyes and gave me the smallest, steadiest nod I've ever received. That was the last time I saw her before the reading. The morning of the reading, I was up at 5:15. I made lunches for Cora and Miles and got them to school. I came home and ironed the cream blouse twice. The first pass was perfect. The second was habit. I put on the charcoal slacks and the low black heels I keep for funerals and serious occasions. The heels were the ones I'd worn to Roy's funeral. I noticed that when I was already in the car. I drove myself. Garrett arrived separately. I found a parking spot on the street a half block from Calendar's office, and I sat in the car for 3 minutes. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to arrive steady. On the walk to the building, I passed the coffee shop where Roy and I had once stopped after one of his appointments. A Tuesday, winter, he'd ordered a black coffee and I'd ordered tea, and we'd talked for 45 minutes about a book on Ohio history he'd been reading, and whether the canal system had ever had a real chance at permanence. A whole conversation about something that had nothing to do with business or family or the careful management of relationships. I stopped on the sidewalk in front of that coffee shop for exactly the length of one breath. Then I went inside the building. The conference room table was rectangular and long. Calendar was already there. Fielding, Bette's attorney, expensive suit, yellow legal pad, was already there. Bette was already there. Pearl earrings, dusty rose blazer, the gold brooch Roy had given her for their 40th anniversary at her lapel. She did not look at me. Garrett arrived 3 minutes after I sat down. He took the middle seat, equidistant. I counted the ceiling tiles. 22. And then the reading began. Calendar read the property division first. The house, Bette's outright. A secondary account, split between Garrett and a charitable fund Roy had established years ago. The proceeds of the business sale, already distributed per a prior arrangement. Standard language. Fielding was writing on his pad. And then Calendar turned a page and read, "And to Wren Marie Calloway Hargrove, I leave the proceeds of the investment account held at Kettering Federal, account ending 4471, and the deed to the Ridgeline Drive property in Yellow Springs, as recognition of her steadiness and her care for this family, given freely and without obligation." I did not make a sound. Fielding moved immediately. He raised the question of Roy's cognitive state at the time of signing, suggesting the document may have been executed during a period of diminished capacity and should be subject to review. His voice was measured, professionally skeptical, as if he had rehearsed this exact intervention in the car on the way over. Calendar reached for the rust-colored folder. He set it on the table, open. The coffee ring on the corner of the cover faced the room. He placed a notarized document in front of Fielding and said, without raising his voice, "The amendment was witnessed and notarized by Judge Harold Mathers at a private appointment on March 14th, 3 years prior to the date of Roy's diagnosis and 38 months before his death. The judge's certification and date are on page 2. Fielding looked at page 2. He wrote nothing on his yellow legal pad. Calendar then removed a second sheet from the folder, a photostat of a handwritten page, and said he wanted to read the addendum Roy had written in the margin of the original document at the time of signing. I want to stop for just 1 second, because what happened next was, I don't have a cleaner word for it than true. If you've ever needed something to be officially, permanently, irrevocably true, and not just felt, but confirmed, please hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not already, because this is why I tell this story. Because sometimes the person who saw you wrote it down. Calendar read it once, at the same volume he'd used for everything else. For Wren, who never asked. That was all. 6 words. Roy's handwriting, the same hand that had inscribed the Wildflower book, the same hand that had written "Love, Dad" on a birthday card, read aloud in a conference room in Dayton, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in March. Fielding set his pen down on the legal pad. He did not pick it back up. He said nothing more. The reading continued for another 4 minutes. Formalities, timelines, next steps, and I heard them in the way you hear things through water. Present, functional, muffled. When it was over, I thanked Robert Calendar. I picked up my bag, the Wildflower book inside, Roy's inscription face up, and I walked out. In the lobby, I passed Donna, who had been sitting in one of the chairs by the door, her navy cardigan, Roy's old wristwatch on her wrist. She hadn't been at the conference table. She'd just come anyway, and sat in the lobby the way you sit with someone outside a hospital room during something hard. She didn't say anything when I came out. She stood up. She put her hand briefly on my arm, just the weight of it, nothing more, and then she let go. And then I walked out into the cold March air and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the building, and I thought about what Roy had known about me, and what he had done with that knowledge, and the particular courage it requires to say, "I see you. I want the record to reflect that I see you, and I am willing to put my name on it." I thought about Bette at the table in that dusty rose blazer, the gold anniversary brooch catching the light, her jaw set, her hands absolutely still. And for one unguarded second, I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Not an adversary in a campaign. Not the woman who had been telling people I wasn't family for 2 years. I saw an old woman who had loved her husband as much as she was able, and who had discovered after his death that the way she'd loved him hadn't been enough to fill all the spaces in him, and that someone else, someone younger, outside, someone without stakes in the arrangement, had found her way into those spaces simply by listening. That recognition cost me something. It sat in my chest, specific and inconvenient, the whole drive home. I let it. When I pulled into our garage and turned off the engine and sat in the particular quiet of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon after an extraordinary morning, I heard my phone light up on the passenger seat. Garrett's name on the screen. I didn't answer Garrett's call in the garage. I sat with the phone in my lap until it stopped ringing. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed one more minute of being alone with what had just happened. When I came inside, he was already at the kitchen table. He had driven straight home. He had his jacket still on, his keys on the table in front of him, and he was looking at his hands. Miles was at school. Cora was at school. The house was quiet in a way houses rarely are in the middle of a weekday, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. And that felt right, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't require very careful handling. Then Garrett said, "She told me you talked him into it." I said, "I know she did." He said, "Did you?" I said, "No, but I understand why she needed that to be true." He looked at me for a while after that. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether you believe them, and I held his eyes and didn't add anything, because I meant what I said and I didn't need to ornament it. After a long moment, he nodded slowly, a single nod, the kind that means, "I hear you, and I'm working with it." We sat at the kitchen table for a while longer without speaking. I could hear the furnace running. I could hear the refrigerators hum. I thought about the date on the notarization and the fact that Garrett had been in that room and heard it read aloud, and that facts, unlike stories, don't require anyone's endorsement to be true. I thought about that a lot in the weeks afterward. The consequences that followed from the reading were not loud. They were structural, the way damage to a foundation is structural, most of it underground, most of it visible only in what it eventually shifts. Fielding withdrew Betty's challenge within 10 days of the reading. Calendar's assistant called to let me know. I thanked her and hung up and went back to the chicken I was thawing for dinner. 2 weeks after the reading, Betty's friend Joanna, who ran the garden club, who had been at several dinners where I was Garrett's wife and nothing more, called Donna to ask if the story she'd heard about Roy's trust was true. Donna confirmed, without elaboration, that Roy had made his wishes known through proper legal channels 3 years before his death, witnessed by a judge, and that the document was valid and uncontested. Joanna apparently said, "Oh," and then she said, "I wish someone had told me before I said the things I said." Donna relayed this to me without commentary. I didn't ask what Joanna had said. I didn't need to, and I had decided that the things said during that period were not things I was going to spend my energy cataloging. The pastor's wife, the woman Bette had tried to introduce me to as Garrett's first wife, stopped me after a church event in April. Garrett and I had started going sporadically. It was complicated. And told me she'd heard what had happened, and that she thought Roy had known what he was doing. She said it simply, and looked at me straight. I said I thought so too. She squeezed my hand briefly and moved on. Lydia, Garrett's cousin, texted me in May. "I'm sorry I listened to some things I shouldn't have. I just want you to know I know better now." I texted back, "I know you do. Thank you." That was all. Some people came back quietly and imperfectly, and I let them. Because imperfect is what people are when they've been working with incomplete information, and most of them hadn't had the full story until the reading made it impossible to avoid. That did not come back. That and I did not speak for the rest of that year. I do not know exactly what happened inside her orbit after the challenge was withdrawn, but Garrett told me, once, with care, that she had stopped calling on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that she still called, but less, that something had shifted in the calls, less campaign, more age, more quiet. He said she had asked about Miles's school project. He said she had not mentioned the trust. I did not ask him to choose between us, and I did not tell him what I thought he should do about his mother. What I did was write her a letter in June, 6 months after the reading. Not a long letter. I wrote it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening while Garrett helped Cora with a history project, and I wrote 3 drafts and threw them away. And then I wrote one that said what I actually meant. I said that I know the last few years have been hard. I know losing Roy was hard. And I know you've been trying to hold things together in the way you know how to hold them. I'm not writing to relitigate what happened. I'm writing to say that I loved Roy too. Not instead of you, alongside you. He was a man worth loving, and I don't think he would want the fact that he loved us both to become a reason for war. He wrote down what he thought of me because he wanted it to be true after he was gone. I don't think he wrote it to hurt you. I think he wrote it to protect something he could see, and you couldn't, which is what fathers do when they know they're running out of time. I hope someday that lands for you the way I mean it. I sealed it and mailed it. I didn't tell Garrett. A week later, he mentioned that his mother had called on a Tuesday, and she'd sounded, he said, different. He wasn't sure how to describe it. Like she'd put something down, he said. He didn't know what. I said I was glad. He looked at me for a moment, and I think he knew something had happened between his mother and me that he wasn't going to be told about. And he let it be. Which was, in its own way, the most grown-up thing he'd done in 2 years. Donna called me in September. She said she wanted me to have Roy's journal. Not a copy. The original. She said she'd kept it long enough, and that Roy would have wanted the right person to have it. I drove to Yellow Springs on a Saturday afternoon. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours and talked about Roy. Who he actually was. What he was afraid of. What he was proud of. What he said about Garrett when Garrett wasn't listening. What he said about me. She said, "He used to say you were the still point." I asked her what that meant. She said she thought it meant the place the family pivoted around without knowing it. I drove home in the late afternoon light with the journal on the passenger seat. I put it in the nightstand drawer on my side of the bed, next to the Wildflower book. On a Sunday morning in October, a clear, cold morning, the kind Ohio makes in fall like it's trying to make up for everything, I was in the backyard with Miles, who was looking for spiders because he had become passionately interested in spiders, and I was sitting on the back step with my coffee and the Wildflower book in my lap, open to the page about goldenrod. And I thought, not in words exactly, but in the way you know something deep in the chest. Roy saw me. He saw what I did for this family without being asked, and he believed it was worth something. And he put his name on that belief in a room with a judge and a notary and a date that could never be changed. My name is Wren Calloway Hargrove. I'm 43 years old, and for the first time in a very long time, that sentence doesn't feel like something I have to argue. It just feels like a fact. If you've carried a story like this one, if someone decided for a long time whether you counted, and you kept showing up anyway, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Hit like if this reached you somewhere real. Subscribe if you want to stay, and share this with someone who needs to hear that the record doesn't always stay the way the loudest person wrote it. I'll see you in the next one.